When the trailer for Stranger Things Season 4 dropped this year, I, like many others on the internet, cribbed about how it had been so many years since the last season that I wasn't sure if I even cared about it anymore. And now I've rewatched the entire show twice in less than 2 months. I think Season 4 did a great job reeling viewers back in despite the prolonged hiatus, expanding on the upside down lore, the introduction of lovable new characters, as well as a terrifying villain, and catching us up on familiar favorites. And one aspect of the story that played a big part in me getting reinvested was the character arc of Will Byers. I was pleasantly surprised at how forward the writers were being about Will's sexuality this season, that they were actually committing to exploring that aspect of him. What had previously been relegated to subtext is now just text. And in my opinion, it's written into the show really well. However, there are those who disagree, and accusations of queerbaiting immediately emerged after the drop of both Volume 1 and 2. The basic definition of queerbaiting is a marketing technique for fiction and entertainment in which creators hint at but then do not actually depict same-sex romance or other LGBT representation. And I can understand that certain fans are wary. Queerbaiting has been an issue, with many showrunners picking up on the fact that fans like the idea of certain same-sex pairings, implying through action and dialogue to string those fans along, only to not deliver on it and then act like those fans were crazy for thinking there was any homoerotic subtext. On the other hand, there are instances where the movie or show promises no such thing, yet fans get carried away and insist on something that isn't there, only to end up angry and disappointed. But neither of those are the case when it comes to Will Byers. I strongly disagree that Stranger Things is queerbaiting its viewers or being cowardly in its depiction of Will's homosexuality. Will is gay. He is in love with Mike. Just because his love isn't reciprocated doesn't make it queerbaiting. Just because they're not spoon-feeding the audience doesn't make it queerbaiting. I think we've gotten so used to surface-level, Tumblr-fied token LGBTQ representation in media that anything with more nuance and build-up tends to feel like queerbaiting. Look, I get it. For the longest time, LGBTQ rep was either completely missing from our screens or characters were queer-coded villains and sidekicks. Having blatant, in-your-face depiction can feel good sometimes, especially since many heterosexual romances get to have it. But not all stories call for that, and demanding that representation be done in a very narrow and specific way that yields instant gratification comes at a detriment to plot and character development. It might start limiting different types of queer stories creatives might want to tell but will be too afraid to for fear of queerbaiting accusations. Then we'll end up with more cringy garbage lifted straight from Twitter discourse and TikTok buzzwords.
Oppression Olympics. Let's go.
Oppression Olympics. Let's go.
A lot of fans want to view Will from a modern lens and project the norms of our time onto him when it isn't appropriate for his story. The level of acceptance and visibility the LGBTQ community has today is a very recent phenomenon, and most of the time it only really feels that way because of how amplified those voices are on social media. A safe space away from the real world where intolerance is still quite common. As recent as the early 2010s, you would still get bullied for being gay. I'm not sure why fans expect a teenage boy in the 80s, during the height of the AIDS panic, from a small conservative town who's been called homophobic slurs his entire childhood, even by his own father, to have some grand, explicit coming out at such an incipient point in his journey. A lot of gay men who grew up at the time have expressed relatability to Will, and it's disrespectful to dismiss their experiences. This is a character who has not had exposure to the LGBTQ community, who does not have the resources to explore that community, who doesn't even have the proper vocabulary to vocalize what he's feeling. And what little he has heard about others like himself has been negative. The writing and acting very effectively convey the shame he must be feeling of his father and bullies turning out to be right, how isolated he feels despite being surrounded by those who love him, the fear that they might stop loving him if they found out the truth, and the palpable yearning and heartache of unrequited love. Will was nowhere near close to coming out this season when his character is still navigating the confusion of what he feels and why he feels it. Having him come out now would have just felt like sloppy storytelling and a disservice to his character. The Duffer Brothers have subtly laid the groundwork since the very first episode of the series.
Look, he's a sensitive kid. Lonnie used to say he was queer, called him a fag.
Is he?
He's missing, is what he is.
But what we do get this season is a beautiful scene between Will and his older brother Jonathan, who tells him, in the most discreet way possible, that whenever he's ready to talk, he'll be there for him and always love him for who he is. And that's what Will needs in that moment of uncertainty. Some validation. And I've heard a lot of people say that the depiction doesn't have to be historically accurate because this is a sci-fi show with monsters and magic. But it's not exactly the same as Lord of the Rings, which takes place in a completely different world to our own. Stranger Things is set in our world, rooted in our reality, with a supernatural running parallel. I also see people comparing Will to Robin, arguing that if she can be out, then so can he. Except she isn't out, not to anyone other than Steve, whom she told under the influence of drugs because he thought she had a crush on him and was hitting on her. The new season shows her fear of being outed.
You ask out a girl and she says no. Big deal. Nothing happens. Maybe your ego's a little bruised, but I ask out the wrong girl and bam, I'm a town pariah.
Some fans might also say that not spelling out Will's sexuality explicitly on the show will leave room for doubt. But I don't believe the writers should have to compromise the integrity of the story just because of some willfully ignorant homophobes. If the original show Bible mentioning Will's sexual identity issues isn't going to convince them, and if the actor playing him confirming it isn't going to convince them, and the track playing during one of his scenes being called In the Closet isn't going to convince them, and scenes like this...
Want to dance? Yeah.
I have seen into the future, and I've seen that today is a new day. A day free of girls.
It's not my fault you don't like girls.
isn't going to convince them, then nothing will. I've seen a lot of them argue that Will is just emotionally stunted, that what he's been through makes him want to go back to how things were instead of growing up. But you know what? Those things aren't mutually exclusive. Will's trauma did rob him of his childhood, and he's struggling with his sexuality. The whole point is to watch that arc reach its completion next season, when he comes to terms with who he is while Vecna probably tries to exploit his fears. I have faith that it's all going to come together in a satisfying conclusion to his journey. Then there's also a third type of complaint about Will. Those fans who ask, who cares if he's gay? How does that solve the monster problem? It's not important to the story. Well, it's clearly important to the writers who made it a big part of his character. It's almost like characters are supposed to be multifaceted and have more personal stakes that flesh out the plot. It's almost like surrealistic, supernatural monsters are often used to reflect a character's inner demons, a common trope in the fantasy genre. I feel like the root of all these complaints is a lack of media literacy these days. Much of the audience not being able to follow narrative cues or recognize motifs, wanting to be told instead of shown, just wanting the plot to race from point A to point B without the patience to let the story beats breathe. I'm truly not trying to be condescending, but if we keep expecting payoff before the setup, we're going to continue being saddled with underbaked, lackluster representation. Stranger Things is one of the biggest shows in the world, and one of its most integral characters, who is shown to be selfless and intelligent and compassionate, happens to be queer. I cannot wait to see how the story comes full circle with Will Byers taking center stage one last time, and instead of getting lost again, actually finding himself.